When you come into existence, you have no sense of distinction between yourself and the world. You don't know what you are because you haven't defined yourself. Now, people think that, well, but Leah, what definition could there be other than that I'm a baby and that I'm a human and that I grew up and became an adult? How else could I define myself? Well, actually, there are many other ways you could have defined yourself. And it's not just a matter of defining yourself physically as a human or not. It's, for humans, there's a lot more complexity to how we define ourselves than just physically. Your physical definition is just a tiny tip of the iceberg of your self-definition. And really, in this series, we're going to be much more interested in the other ways in which you define yourself beyond your physical definitions. Although, of course, your physical definitions are all constructed by you. You constructed your physical definition, and you have actually separated yourself from your environment such that you now think that's real and that's physical, when in fact, that's purely mental and conceptual. So you created this conceptual distinction. Self and other, or self and world, are created in a single slice, in a single step. So what we ultimately have at the biggest picture is we have an infinite field of consciousness. That's what reality is, an infinite field of consciousness. And then within that, by creating this distinction between self and other, you create a virtual partition. It's not an actual partition. You didn't actually divide consciousness in two. It's a virtual partition. I use this concept of virtual partitions because I like it from creating hard drive partitions. You know, if you ever formatted a hard drive, you can create multiple partitions on there, and it's just a single hard drive, but then you can subdivide it into as many parts as you want. That's exactly what's happening within the universe. That's how objects are coming into being, through virtual partitions. And then their death is the elimination of the virtual partition. And if you eliminate all the virtual partitions, all you're left with is the oneness of the original hard drive. So imagine an infinite hard drive with an infinite number of virtual partitions, of which you yourself are one. And so you came into existence when one of these virtual partitions was created. And that's when you looked at yourself and you said, oh, I am this. And whatever you thought this was is what you became. So what survival is at the biggest picture level is it's the maintaining of virtual partition within infinite consciousness. That's what you're doing here in the world. That's life. You're maintaining this partition. Now, notice about this partition, it's not a simple line that you draw like this between you and the environment. And notice when you draw one line, you're creating two parts. See, you draw one line, one division, creating two parts, self and other. But this line, when a human draws this line, it's very complicated. It's not a simple vertical line. It's a squiggly, complicated, messy, chaotic line. This line is unique for every human being. And this line is what is being survived, so to speak. And if this line changes too much, you either become a new human being, that would be growth, or you actually die. So the distinction between self and other is what's creating the survival drive. But conversely, because it's a two-way street, the imperative to survive as a form is what creates the distinction between self and other. So these two are working simultaneously, sort of a chicken and egg problem. Which came first? They both feed into each other. So here's a key insight for you, one of many about survival that I'll be underscoring. This is the first one. What's being survived is not a physical object, the way that people imagine, the way that science imagines, the way the materialist paradigm imagines. Rather, what's being survived is a conceptual boundary, a fantasy. That's why I call it a virtual partition, to distinguish it from an actual partition. So you are a virtual being in a certain sense. That doesn't mean you're living in a computer simulation. It just means that your sense of self is a virtual thing.